years after its initial release on PC, Metro Exodus is getting a standalone update titled the PC Enhanced Edition. This free update coming out on May 6th for all owners of the original game aims to update Metro Exodus's graphical and performance presentation by going to the extreme and requiring a ray tracing GPU to even work at all. That is right, Metro Exodus's PC Enhanced Edition is the first AAA game on PC to require a GPU capable of hardware-accelerated ray tracing through DXR here. So, with that fact, you know that 4A Games has added quite a bit to its ray tracing implementation. Alongside this, the Enhanced Edition adds in variable rate shading and a very welcome addition of DLSS 2.1 for use on RTX GPUs. Now, back in the beginning of 2019, I really loved Metro Exodus for its large levels, which broke with the traditional linear design the Metro series has been known for since 2010. But back then I also really loved the ray tracing implementation, which made me declare Metro Exodus my best graphics of the year in 2019. So how exactly have 4A Games pushed the bar even further in terms of performance and visuals here, in what was already a cutting-edge game on PC? That is what this video is all about, looking at the upgrades of the Enhanced Edition, the performance, as well as direct insight from the developer on what ray tracing means to them. So gear up, Ranger, and join me on this journey as I chart the upgrades of Metro Exodus's PC Enhanced Edition. The biggest update to Metro Exodus through this separate standalone update really has to be the changes and additions to its ray tracing implementation. The 2019 version of Metro Exodus shipped with single bounce global illumination from the sun and ray traced ambient occlusions for all the indoor areas away from the sun and moon. The ray tracing looked great in comparison to the real-time global illumination system that was already found in the rasterized version of the game on PC and console. At the same time, this global illumination back then, in 2019, was added midway through development, so the game was designed with two different lighting schemes at the same time. One without RTGI and one with. So that meant a lot of extra work for the developers, and they could not necessarily design the game to completely take advantage of ray trace global illumination. With the Enhanced Edition, 4A has added a lot of features to the RT, but importantly, has gone back into the game with artists and rebalanced the game's entire lighting to work exclusively only with ray tracing, cutting out many of the tricks and fake lights and other legacy lighting that was needed for the game without ray tracing back then. So much of this re-release's lighting is now done through ray tracing. So that is why it requires a ray tracing GPU, because most of the lighting would not show up at all really without one in this version of the game, unlike that 2019 release. So what are the specific enhancements to the ray tracing in this Enhanced Edition? Firstly, every shadow casted light in the game now contributes to global illumination. So all torches, flares, flashlights, glowy green mushrooms, and more, anything that casts a light with shadows now has its light bounce around the environments and pick up shades of the colors of the objects that it hits along the way. Global illumination from such smaller lights was not in the release in 2019. So let me show off what this does through an example in the Enhanced Edition. Here I am in the Volga map as I docked a train car in this garage just before the sun rises. Pointing the camera in between the train cars in the garage, you can see how it is rather dark inside the garage at this time of day. The light that is coming in is primarily from the sky lighting, which you can see through the door on the other side of the train track here, as well as through the opening of the garage where the one train car is coming in through. Now let's turn on the one light attached to the front of that train car. As you can see now, the scene is filled with a lot of light, all coming from one singular light source. If we look, this lamp shows off really well how light now bounces around the scenes in the Enhanced Edition. First, you have the direct light from the lamp hitting the carriage in front here, causing a stark circular hit of light there. Then the light from this area bounces off the train car in many directions, but with a lot of light bouncing off the train car back in the direction of the lamp itself, towards the train car at the front of the garage. We can see this bounced back light really easily on the top of the garage above the car, as well as really easily on the columns to the left and right of the garage's opening, which are perfectly lit up. The bounce light from this is so intense that we can even see shadows being formed from the bounce lighting between the column and the wall here, where bounce lighting is being obscured by the column and producing a very stark shadow. If you notice as well, the color of all this light being bounced around the scene is not 100% white, rather it is an off-white, tinged by the color of the lamp and the train car it is bouncing off of. This bouncing of color from such lights as a part of global illumination in the enhanced edition can be more or less obvious depending upon the light intensity and the color of the object that is being hit by light. Take this scene where I am shining my flashlight on this red flag on the wall. Immediately as the flashlight is turned on, the light from my flashlight hits the flag and bounces red light all over the entire room. Seen from the third-person perspective in photo mode, this is even more visible, where you can see the red light hitting the tiny trophy mounts on the wall, as well as the pillows and chair below. The precision of this bounce light is so detailed that if you look on the bookshelf to the right here, you can see bounced red lighting being intense enough to produce delicate shadows behind the books and the radio on the shelf as that bounce light is being obscured. This local global illumination from artificial lights is what gives indoor areas of this enhanced edition this surprisingly realistic lighting continuity, as there's no ambient occlusion anymore which is grounding objects to scenery, but instead natural shadows from bounced lighting and colored lighting intermingles with the objects, creating this realistic scene. And since it is ray tracing, it is working dynamically on moving objects and moving light sources as well. Check here the scene in the Caspian section of the game as I'm entering this bunker with Gulinara. The only light in this scene really is her flashlight, which moves back and forth with her character animation. As she is tracking that light back and forth against the wall, take notice how the entire ambient color of the room around her is changing with each movement of the light, as the surface the light is hitting is changing the bounce color of the lighting and its intensity depending upon the material surface. Also notice how the shadows produced from this bounce lighting are moving with the light as well. Like here, the shadow underneath the chair. This chair is not really being touched directly by the light beam, but instead underneath it, there is a constantly moving soft shadow corresponding with the light being bounced from the wall above. This new global illumination from such dynamic local lights has a dramatic impact on the game's visual quality in comparison to the 2019 version. Like here, in the opening of the game, with the original version on the left and the enhanced edition on the right. In both scenes there's an opening on the right hand side where bluish white light is being cast from. This causes tons of white bluish light to bounce around the scene, producing extra shadows behind the pipes and scattered objects on the left side of the image, and extra highlights overall, but easily being seen on the service boxes to the right. In comparison, without this systemic bounce lighting, the original version on the left, lacking GI from local light sources, is very dark actually, and lacks the nuance of the image on the right. Or take this area slightly further ahead, as we look into the fire pit, and there's another opening in the roof of the metro to the left here where light is shining down and hitting patches of white snow. In the old version, any area not touched directly by the light sources in the scene fades almost to a pitch black. If we show the new version here, we can see how the fire's orange glow bounces around the scene, creating readily visible shadows behind the wires on the right and giving shadows some of that orange glow. At the same time, the opening in the metro roof on the left with its light hitting the snow below is bouncing bluish white light off that snow onto the rest of the scene, so the objects on the floor now are getting directional lighting and shadows from the left-hand side. Every single indoor scene is affected in such a dramatic manner. Like here, outside Yamantau, where the reddish-white bounce light from the floor is added into the shadowed regions here, coloring the sides of the luggage facing our character. Or here in the elevator a little bit further ahead, where the light bouncing around the inside of the elevator on the wood and metal lightens up the shadows to take on a reddish hue. Whereas without global illumination in the old version on the left, all shadows are once again almost pitch black. For those of you looking at these comparison images and wondering now whether Metro Exodus has lost some of its darkest, indoor, moodiest moments due to global illumination from such lights, you don't need to actually worry. The game still, of course, has many sections that are incredibly devoid of lighting and really dark. There are a lot of these scenes still. It's just now that those solitary lights found in such dark scenes color the scenery a bit more, so shadows around such solitary lights have a bit of color to them instead of just going straight to pitch black. Another addition to the ray tracing on top of this is ray traced emissive surfaces. So surfaces like flames or the various lights of different shapes and volumes give off light from their entire surface area, casting diffuse shadows around the environment. To give you and the audience a sense of what this looks like, on a basic level, I asked 4A Games to provide me footage with a purely emissive surface moving around the game scene. So here in the editor, a large rectangular block is being moved around the environment by an artist. As the block moves around the scene, you can see how it spreads light around the environment, and the shape of that light adheres to the shape of that rectangular block. As it passes near and through the doors, soft shadows change and move. You can see this really well if you look at the soft shadows from the railings on the stair. Notice how the shadows from the railings move when I slow it down, and how these shadows start off sharp and distinct and then taper off into the yellowish light. As the light stops, we can see how this light is localized to the area it is in underneath the stairwell, and how light is not leaking to the other side of the staircase where light would be blocked. In a normal rasterized renderer, such an area light could not cast diffuse shadows, and its light would definitely be leaking to the other side of obstructing geometry. So what we're seeing here is not really possible at all without ray tracing. In the enhanced edition, such large and demonstrative area lights from emissive surfaces are not exactly common. I mean, it's not like you just see a block of light moving around the scene often. Rather, you can see such emissive area lights from the flames from a Molotov cocktail. From the flames from the flamethrower in the Two Kernels DLC. Or from tube or rectangular light sources scattered across the game world. You can even see little bits of emissive glow from the light-emitting phosphorescent dots on gun sights. So on your own gun sights, slightly lighting up the metal adjacent to the dots, or on the gun sights of enemy weapons as well, lighting up the small bits of area around them. In comparison to the original game from 2019, which does not have emissive area lights that are ray traced like this, the differences just mean much more realistic lighting and shadowing. Like, check out this scene here from the opening Moscow section of the original version of the game. Here there's a white tube light above that is not ray traced as an emissive surface. Rather, it looks to use an approximate area light, which a lot of games with rasterized lighting have. It can mimic the rectangular shape of a light and how it spreads around the environment, but it cannot create the shadows from such a light. So in the 2019 version, all the objects in the scene underneath this rectangular light have no direct shadows really, and the only thing grounding them to the floor and creating some form of contact shadows is ray traced ambient occlusion, which that 2019 version has. This creates small bits of darkening around the objects when they come in contact with one another, like here around the legs of the table as they meet the floor. Now let's check out that same scene and area light in the new enhanced edition renderer, which is a ray traced emissive surface. Notice how the light spreads around the environment differently. I would say adhering more to the shape of that light's surface, but importantly, look how that light is now better obscured and shadowed in those areas where the light is not reaching. Like the underside of the stretcher in the back here. Or how the chair now has a diffuse shadow coming from it. Or how there's a very distinct shadow from the legs of the table and the tabletop. The way the image as it looks on the left, as found in the old version, is actually very common to see in games, where there is a light or an area light approximation, but it is not realistic or performant to add shadows to it. as rasterization really cannot do that. A similar effect can be seen throughout the entire campaign, but one really interesting usage of these emissive area lights is for candle flames. For performance reasons, a number of scenes feature candles in the original game, yet they are not tagged as shadow casting lights, as many shadow maps for each light for each candle flame would definitely plummet the frame rate. So like here in the Yamantau map, again, in this cutscene, if I freeze the frame and we look at the candles on the floor to the left and the right of the doctor here in the cutscene, we can see how the candles on the left here have had both of their flames simplified into a singular non-shadow casting point light. So the candles on top of the stone here cast non-shadow casting light around it. So that light will leak through to the other side of objects like the pile of bricks it is on top of, or the ground underneath the skull, as no shadows can be cast. Light is leaking through essentially, and you can also see this on the doctor's leg, where he almost looks like he's floating on the ground as there's no shadow being cast from his foot and leg in the direction of the candles. The same can be said of the grouping of candles to the right here between these characters' legs. Now let us flip over to the enhanced edition with ray traced emissive lights. Notice immediately how all that glowing and light leaking from the original is gone, as the undersides of objects are now darkened as their surfaces are obscuring light. Notice how the skull casts this really cool soft shadow from the two candles behind it, and how the doctor's feet on the floor actually have shadows casting to them, grounding him to that floor and being properly darkened. The same with the candles on the right, where light is no longer leaking through the bricks from the top. Essentially, the scene has much less light leaking and very realistic, subtle, soft shadows. In the end, this is a rather huge upgrade to the game's lighting fidelity. The upgrades just keep piling on from here though, as the Enhanced Edition also upgrades the game's global illumination in general, from being a single bounce of global illumination from the sun or moon to being an infinite amount of bounces essentially. The difference to the old version of ray traced global illumination from the 2019 version is monumental. Where the old RTGI would taper into darkness quickly after one bounce, the new RTGI fills the entire scene with bounce lighting off a variety of surfaces, creating new shadows and new light sources of its own in the process. I cannot state this enough, really. The difference is so large with all the extra bounces of light that it is hard to put into words at times. All the bounces and subtle interrelations of color and shadow dramatically increase the realism of many of the game's scenes. Like, check out this scene here with Stepan lying in the train car. The original version of RTGI biases the lighting to be dark after the first bounce, of course. Yet the new version adds in tons of extra lighting, increasing the scene's contrast actually, and making the indirect shadows and indirect highlights much more visible. Or here in that same train car. Both versions of course show bounce lighting, but with infinite bounces in the new version, there's a lot higher glow and the contrast is higher as well. And if we look at the pipes in the adjacent room, we can see how the reflection or specular component of the GI is now much more pronounced as energy spreads across surfaces instead of stopping after that first bounce. RT lighting now also properly affects transparent surfaces, volumetric fog, and particles. So particles are properly lit up from ray traced emissive lighting like you see from the flames here in the game's DLC chapter, or materials like eyes and hair will properly receive the correct level of bounce lighting or direct lighting from ray tracing instead of using some approximate, which could occasionally cause things like hair to glow. I didn't imagine I would be saying this, but the game almost looks a generation apart from the old RTGI in terms of lighting. This is impressive considering the old RTGI, more often than not, made the 2019 game look a generation different than the standard rasterized lighting. And it actually still does. It's just now that with infinite bounces, the lighting is even more accurate. And since the game has now been retooled to purposefully take advantage of RTGI completely, every scene looks so much better for it. Altogether, the infinite bounce RTGI produces stupefying and realistic lighting conditions that generally almost look like offline renderings, like light maps you would see in a game with purely static lighting, where nothing moves. But in this game, the lighting is done in real time, where the sun and the sky are constantly changing. One of my favorite places to observe all this light and shadow play is at the threshold of an area where the light from outside is just being obscured. Like here, you can see the sun and the skylight pouring in and just bounce around the scene. And you can see all these subtle secondary shadows, like from the rifle propped up against the wall, and all the colors intermixing. It's astonishing, and I really could spend the rest of this video just hyperbolizing it. Instead, I'll just sum it up in one sentence. Metro Exodus's PC Enhanced Edition's global illumination produces without a doubt the best lighting I have ever witnessed in a video game. And just when you thought the list of upgrades might be over, 4A has gone in and added in ray trace reflections to Metro Exodus, which is an upgrade, of course, that is very welcome. Talking about these ray trace reflections by themselves is not exactly easy though, as the global illumination in Metro Exodus already essentially is producing ray traced reflections of a sort. It's just that they're reflections of a general color and lighting direction as a blob almost. These ray traced reflections they added kind of cover the more precise types of reflections and handle special surfaces, like reflections found on water, which is a transparent surface. The RT reflections help clean up those areas like on water where SSR would fail and fall back poorly to a cube map, causing light to leak through, as you can see here on the water in this scene, in the old version of Metro Exodus on the left, and the new version on the right, where there's no glowing hole in the reflection found under the roof of this sunken house. These ray traced reflections are similar to other titles you have seen in some respects and very different in others. For one, like other titles, they do blend in screen space information to enhance detail and account for aspects like particles and volumetric fog. At the same time, these reflections use the same lower quality materials as the RT global illumination. So if you look at the reflection out of view, it's possible to see how the materials of a surface are simplified, like those here where SSR is not blending in. The reflections likewise do not include alpha masked geometry like leaves on trees, so if you move the camera down in such areas where there's a lot of leaves, they will definitely disappear right out of the picture. And lastly, the RT reflections do not seem to cover transparent surfaces that are not water, as far as I can tell. So the glass here on the left shows reflections in this indoor scene, but as I move the camera, you can see that these reflections are primarily in screen space. All these compromises in the end, though, actually do not end up being wholly distracting in any way, as the reflections fill more of a role of preventing light leaking, as all the game's primary lighting is included in them. It also definitely helps that Metro Exodus in general does not have very shiny materials that make any of these compromises very obvious. There's a lot of rust and grime and dust getting in the way. This ray tracing upgrade seems like a pretty big win for the players of Metro Exodus, but perhaps the upgrade for the developers is even greater. As I mentioned, Exodus's Enhanced Edition was designed fully around ray trace lighting to the point where the game only runs with it on, and you need a ray tracing GPU to play this game. This is a first of its kind. Given this unique situation, I asked 4A Games to send me recordings that would essentially demonstrate the differences that this ray trace lighting had on their game development. So here's a recording of a lighting artist setting up a scene to work in the previous rasterized lighting system without the ray trace GI. Metro Exodus has fully dynamic lighting, where nearly every light in the environment can either move or be extinguished or turned off. So that means the game cannot use baked out static lighting like a lot of other games. Given this, an artist, when setting up direct lights like these hanging from the ceiling above, needs to tie them to manually placed fill lights, as they're called, that can also be turned off in the case that those lights above are shot out. These fill lights the artist is seen cloning and moving around the scene here are used to fill the scene with that emulated look of bounce lighting, lighting up the shadows from being pure black. This is essentially done by eye as the artist moves them around the scene to find places where the lights look like they should be to emulate the look of bounce light. For example, here under the concrete overhang with the pillars, the artist has to manually place the point lights here to an area at the threshold of the overhang to make it look like light is hitting the ground and bouncing up onto the area nearby, adjusting the intensity and colors manually if need be. This type of work can be very labor intensive, and after it is done, it may need to be redone should the environment or assets change, or if it needs another production art pass for gameplay or aesthetic reasons. That is the old workflow. For the new workflow, the artist deletes all these lights that they just placed, faking this bounce lighting. They don't need them any longer. Rather, they just hit a single toggleable value in the editor to turn on Ray Trace Global Illumination, which fills the room with light nigh immediately. So this saves the artist potentially hours of work and will update dynamically within a frame should the art need to change or the direct lights need to be moved or turned off for some reason. And if you look underneath the overhang, it's easy to appreciate how much more realistic this ray trace GI is than an emulated approximation that they would have to manually place before. This was just a small room. Imagine any of the larger scenes of the game, like Solantius' church. As you can see here, the debug view shows all these light icons representing point lights, where an artist had to manually place them all inside of this church to emulate the look of light sneaking in from the outside and filling the room. With all the debug views on for them, you can see just how many there are, and imagine how much time this must have taken to iterate and get right. In the new version of that same church in the new engine, there are no manually placed lights for GI. There's just AI markup and the lights for the torches. Yet as you can see, that scene is perfectly lit up and much more accurately than before. And as the artist marches the time of day forward, it's possible to see just how much better it looks as the lighting is far more dynamic, changing its internal color and intensity depending upon the color of the sky or just exactly where the sunlight is hitting in the room. Can even create systemic lighting moments that an artist may not have even intended, but still look rather interesting. Like here, as I played the level, I noticed that light was coming through the window and was hitting a pig. And I could not help but laugh as I noticed that the sunlight hitting the pig was bouncing pink lighting in the area around it. Based on this insight, global illumination being fully real-time and done through ray tracing will save artists at 4A games a lot of time, as well as allowing for bounce lighting to be done dynamically, where the color of the scene changes depending upon all these systemic factors, like you can see here, where the light is touching different surfaces and bouncing the color onto the scene based upon the color of that surface and its material. When we talk about ray tracing at Digital Foundry, we tend to focus on the player-facing advantages for visuals, but ray tracing's very nature as being dynamic and real-time and typically pixel accurate is a huge upgrade for developers in the case where a game is fully designed around it, like the Enhanced Edition is here. Since the developers are only using ray tracing and not shipping two versions of the lighting like they did before in 2019, they can fully embrace it, saving time for themselves and increasing lighting fidelity at that same time. With all these advantages that I've just talked about, there are of course a few catches here or there as we are talking about real-time ray tracing. Amazing technology, but it is something really complex being done at 60 frames per second or even higher. RTGI is real-time in this game, of course, but only the first bounce of light is visible in the first frame after a change of light occurs. The subsequent bounces change in cache in the frames thereafter. I could measure this latency due to a scene here on the Caspian Sea level where the sunlight was culled when I entered this domicile, but there was a bit of wiggle room where I could turn off and on the sunlight in the room by moving backwards and forwards. When I exploited this, I was able to measure in such an instance that all the extra bounces after the first one, which contribute visibly to the final scene image, accrue within about 15 to 20 frames when running the game at 60 FPS. So there can be latency with the later bounces. Another aspect I found very, very rarely is that I once saw what looked like the infinite bounces, almost looking like they were transferring their lighting from the outside surface to an indoor one, perhaps because the shadow map is being used for obscuring bounce light. And lastly, since the game is of course real-time RT, we are talking about low sample counts here for the ray tracing, at ultra 1 ray per pixel. So the denoiser can have trouble sometimes, like if you have a very small bright object, like we see here with this red light, and a very shiny surface, like the gun, where you can see noise from the ray tracing on the gun barrel. Or you have scenes like this one here that I showed at the beginning of the video with the train garage. The secondary bounce lighting here on close inspection shows a moving noise pattern. This was at Ultra RTGI with 4K DLSS quality mode, so the ray tracing was essentially at 1440p here for the 4K image. So now that we have a good sense of what the new ray tracing does, let's look at the options controlling it. Like before, the main ray tracing setting controls the internal resolution of global illumination, but there is now a normal setting below the high which renders the GI at quarter of your internal resolution, and high is checkerboarded of your internal resolution, and ultra is native internal resolution. The scaling for visuals is similar to the 2019 version, with high not looking dramatically different than ultra, even at 1080p here, like you see on an RTX 2060, just with a bit more noise in that resolve. The normal setting, though, I would contend, does show a significant amount of noise in comparison to the high or ultra at times, and the size of the noise in that resolve is larger as well. But this makes sense given what is happening and it being quarter resolution. This setting seems tailored for less powerful GPUs or those with less ray tracing acceleration, as given this scene here, high saves 20% performance and medium saves around 34% when going down from ultra. So nice wins. When adjusting this setting, it helps to take into account what your real internal resolution is, as the lower settings will start to look more pristine the higher your resolution is. So normal looks better at 4K than it definitely looks at 1080p. That is not the only new ray tracing option, of course. Looking at the new ray trace reflections option, I was able to determine that the reflections at 1080p here on the RTX 2060 could cost just around 20% performance in scenes where they were highly visible, and putting this GPU easily below 60 FPS. So this option really is going to be reserved for those who have upper high-end GPUs here. Important to note is that the reflections only show up in the options menu if you have the ultra or extreme graphical preset set, as RT reflections use data first enabled by the ultra preset and above. While talking about these performance differences, I also checked out the differences in performance between the 2019 version and this enhanced one using the same nominal settings. Here in a GPU limited scenario on that RTX 2060 with both set to 1080p, Ultra RT, and overall high settings with tessellation. Here it was possible to see how the enhanced edition, even with added RT bounces and emissive lighting, ran up to around 16% faster, all while looking better. Although you may notice that this cutscene may look a little blurrier in the new version, that is because the depth of field was changed in the enhanced edition. Here I imagine the optimized shaders using things like FP16 in this enhanced edition are helping out performance. But still, the game can also show extremely similar performance like you see here as the train is slowing down and both versions are running nearly the same. Still, that enhanced edition, even while running the same almost, is looking quite a bit better. CPU performance, on the other hand, shows a different story. Here I use the same settings on that same PC with the Ryzen 3600, but turn the resolution way down to show the CPU differences in areas where the GPU is not fully utilized. Here I found that the enhanced edition ran about 13% slower on this CPU in this instance when the game started to become CPU limited. So it would appear that the enhanced edition has increased the game's CPU requirements, which makes sense given how ray tracing probably needs more things to be tracked on the CPU side this time. So what about all the other new ways to increase performance, like variable rate shading? As far as I can tell, this appears to be a tier 1 implementation of VRS, so not like that which we've seen in Gears of War, and it primarily affects forward rendered objects like transparencies in a flat manner. So checking out the modes here on the RTX 2060 at 4K in a scene like this one, looking at the body on the ground, there won't really be any visible difference at all, as VRS would not be affecting the materials in this scene. But in this scene with the fire from the lighter, the fire is a transparency. VRS will apply a blanket alternating 2x1 and 1x2 shading degradation on the fire in the 2x mode. The 4x mode will degrade such transparencies even more. There is a slight performance boost in the 2x mode with it not being very obvious at all, and it would probably help even more in scenes with lots of transparency effects. Here I would recommend VRS 2x for those at very high resolutions, like above 1440p, while not using DLSS. While VRS has more limited utility, DLSS is just amazing as usual. And since the original game used DLSS 1.0, we get the rare opportunity to compare DLSS 2.1 and 1.0's image quality directly. So let's stop this image here in this scene and look at the distant geometry in detail. DLSS 2.1 at the exact same 1440p internal resolution does quite a better job than DLSS 1.0 in reconstructing the detail and applying anti-aliasing without leaving that slight change of stylization that 1.0's generative machine learning tended to have. This really just goes to show how far Nvidia's tech has come. In comparison to native resolution rendering, DLSS 2.1 shows the usual spread, where quality mode somehow always manages to resolve more thin sub-pixel detail than native, while producing less flickering and less weird outline problems like TAA has here, and performance mode reconstructs that all slightly less perfectly. But still, even performance mode here is doing quite an amazing job in comparison to TAA. For those without an RTX GPU, the game does ship with a TAA upsampler, so you can get reconstruction on an AMD GPU here. Basically image reconstruction similar to the tech found in UE4 or Insomniac games. You access this simply by moving the shading slider down in the menu, and then TAA will upsample the image from there. In a direct side-by-side comparison with native, it does an admirable job, especially at the 0.7 value and above. So I definitely recommend using it on an AMD card. In comparison to DLSS 2.1, we see how important that machine learning component really is, as DLSS 2.1 in performance mode, so 1080p internally, manages to look far superior to the TAA upsampling image at the same internal resolution on the left, and it even manages to reconstruct a lot better than a TAA upsampling image at a much higher internal resolution on the right. In light of all these changes, my recommended settings are very similar to Metro 2019, but now classified into tiers. If your GPU performs like an RTX 2070 or less in this game, I recommend high settings with tessellation and normal RTGI. If you have a GPU that performs above this, up to a 2080 Super essentially, I would try these settings as well, trying to get the most resolution out of this experience via DLSS or TAAU. But if you find the lighting still to be grainy, you can try using high ray tracing. For RTX 2080 Ti performance or so, I would recommend the high RTGI settings at high settings going for high res. Above 2080 Ti performance, I recommend the ultra settings with high RTGI and adding on the ray traced reflection setting. But even then, you may find you have enough performance left on top, and GPUs in this class can easily get away with ultra RTGI as well. Now, the last bit of performance data I want to highlight before I close out this video is looking at AMD GPU performance in particular. The only DXR-capable AMD GPU I have is the rather highly clocked XFX Speedster Merc 319 version of the RX 6800 XT. To check out its performance, I ran the game at 1440p with the optimal settings I would use for its competitor at that resolution. So, ultra settings, RT reflections on Ultra GI, and of course 1440p. Here the 6800 XT does an okay job, but in comparison to the Nvidia offering with the 3080, it looks less than impressive. On average, the RTX 3080 runs this more punishing benchmark run 27% faster than the 6800 XT, but with some instances of this run being around 50% faster on that 3080. Usually these cards might be neck and neck in a rasterization title. It just seems that a lot of incoherent rays harm AMD performance more than Nvidia. And I can show this off actually with a little test I made, where at normal RTGI at 1440p here, the RX 6800 XT runs nearly the same as the 3080 at 1440p, but with ultra RTGI. So within a certain rendering time, the RTX 3080 can essentially render 4 times the amount of incoherent rays. In light of this, for AMD cards, I recommend the high RTGI setting for 6800 XT class GPUs and above, and then normal for all those below. Getting to the end of this video, I have a very high opinion of this enhanced edition of Metro Exodus. The game runs better on the GPU and looks a lot better due to the new image quality options like Temporal upsampling or DLSS. With the new RT features on top of this, the game shines like new and looks fantastic, with some scenes at times approaching the lighting quality you may see in an offline rendering image. 4A's success here is built on the daring ambition to be the first AAA game to mandate hardware-accelerated ray tracing on the PC. So while the 2019 version of the game was a glimpse into the future, the Enhanced Edition is essentially that future arriving and being brilliant. It goes without saying too that this update coming out on May 6th is all the more awesome since it is free on PC to all the owners of the original game. So really do check it out if you can. I do not think you will be disappointed. But that's really all I can reasonably say on this subject at the moment. If you did enjoy this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to enable more long-form tech deep dives like this one in the future, support DF on Patreon, which as a platform gives us the freedom and time to make such videos in the first place. If you want to talk to me about anything you saw in this video, write a comment below or follow me and DF on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.